Andrew, he was MinARP and I was with WisARP, and he would take these controversial positions questioning Amtrak. So then, some years later, remember Wisconsin had no money, so WisARP walked the rails from Watertown to Madison, checking every tie, measuring every space, doing calculations of what it would take to move in there. And I had to look at Amtrak's books. Have you ever heard of generally accepted accounting practices?
Yep.
They haven't. So all of a sudden I thought, my God, I've become Andrew Selden. I'm starting to question Amtrak. So
That's pretty low.
with that, we'll introduce Andrew Selden.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to try to make this interesting. I'm going to try to give you a little bit more global perspective as compared to what you heard this morning. 20 years ago this summer, in 1998, I was a candidate to be CEO at Amtrak. And that came about, I found out when I got back from a vacation trip in Europe that some of my so-called friends had thrown my hat into the ring while I was not looking. And your first reaction is, that's not a good idea. But they persuaded me to just let it go and see what happened. And to my amazement, by July of 1998, I was in a two-horse race with George Warrington, who proceeded to bankrupt the company. Seriously, remember, he was the one who had to mortgage Penn Station, New York, to raise money to cover the deficits in the Acela program. And I will never forget the day that I had the interview with the board search committee. It was about half of the members of the board at that time. And they had sent me a package with their strategic plan, which was all based on the Acela trains and Acela branding and all that stuff. And a bunch of financial information, and I'd gone through it all, tried to make sense of it. It was a struggle. I walked into the boardroom, plunked that stuff down on the board table, and after the opening pleasantries, my first comment to them was, if you are looking to hire somebody to execute that plan, I'm probably not the right guy for this job. And you get some startled reactions from these board members. They say, well, Mr. Selden, tell us what you mean by that. And I said, well, it can't work. And I proceeded to explain to them exactly how the plan would fail and about when it would fail. And they, after that and some questions and back and forth, they said, okay, thank you for coming down to talk to us. We'll let you know within the next 10 days or so, because it's really important to us to have a new CEO in position before the start of the upcoming new fiscal year. Okay, that was late July. They were looking at the end of September. Well, it was beyond September. It was into October, as I remember, that I finally got the curt thank you but no thanks kind of letter. So I lost the race. In hindsight, I'm glad I lost the race. I would not want to have taken that job knowing what I know today, have taken that job then. So that was my 15-minute brush with fame. The point of all that for us here today is that 20 years later, we're facing the same issues. It's exactly the same situation. They have a failed business vision from the 1960s, which still animates Amtrak's strategic thinking about who they are and what they're all about. We're facing some, this time, fairly serious threats to the inter-regional trains that make up the long-distance network in the country. And the company is, in both a financial sense and in an intellectual sense, it's basically bankrupt. There's no good creative thinking going on at Amtrak headquarters about how to carry out their mission in the world. So the situation with the long distance trains is that they not only refuse to invest in them, they have no plan. There's zero plan to do anything with the superliners other than wipe them down at the end of each trip. They're not going to replace them. They're not going to augment them. In fact, Anderson, you've all heard this, Anderson has been heard saying he thinks that the long-distance routes would be better served by breaking them up into a series of disconnected short corridors operated with DMUs. And he's apparently very serious about it. They want the interregional trains gone. And it's fair to ask, why is that? What company would want to dump their biggest and most commercially successful business, and I'll explain why that is, in favor of an obsessive focus and almost 100% of their capital investment into what is often their smallest and least commercially successful business? Who does that? And it makes no sense at all. So it's fair, I think, to ask the question, what are they thinking? What is going on in Anderson's mind? Is he dim? I don't think so. I mean, nothing in his record suggests that. Is he being malicious? Is he gullible? Might be gullible because he doesn't know anything about the rail industry. They have a hard time running their business, and they always have. They have certainly in the last 20 years or so. I mean, think of the big picture things. They achieve totally awful financial results year after year. They lost, in very round numbers, $2.5 billion on $3.3 billion in revenue last year. Now that's a bad outcome, and that is characteristic of their outcome every year. They have a declining share of a robust and growing market for intercity passenger surface transportation. Their role in providing intercity surface mobility is declining in a growing market. They have a terrible safety record. The last time that Amtrak achieved a positive rate of return on invested capital was 35 years ago with the superliner orders. Think about that. Think about any business organization you know that has a consistent record of negative rates of return on invested capital. They're worse off in the Northeast Corridor financially when it's fairly accounted for today than they were 20 years ago when Acela was launched. That's a negative return on capital. Their own inspector general says they don't manage their capital projects, their fixed asset development projects very well. And since Graham Claytor left the building, they haven't had a serious growth strategy. Remember all the talk during the Warrington years about how Acela was going to save the railroad, turn things around, Brave New World? Well, it never happened. The simplest explanation is something that I'm frequently reminded of, and that is bad information from a bad management information system usually leads to bad results. And I think that's what's going on. I think management's getting bad information from a bad MIS. And I'm frequently reminded by one of my colleagues in URPA, never, he says, never assume conspiracy when simple ineptitude provides a sufficient explanation. So, proceeding from that, I propose that we give Anderson the benefit of the doubt and assume for sake of discussion that that's what's happening. He's getting bad information. And I will assert to you, and I mean this very seriously, if all you knew about Amtrak was what Stephen Gardner and Amtrak's management information system called APT, the Amtrak Performance Tracking System, if all you knew was what Gardner and APT told you, you'd do what Anderson's doing too. It's the only rational response. Because APT and Gardner tell Anderson, just like they tell senators from New Mexico and they tell the media and they tell members of Congress about the long distance trains, nobody rides them and they cost a fortune. Well, what thinking person wants to pour new capital into a deal that nobody buys and costs a fortune? It makes no sense to do that. But that's backwards. And I'm going to show you today how it's backwards and how they end up in that pickle. Amtrak, in their top-level management decision-making, their strategic planning, their capital allocations, is using the wrong metrics to guide those decisions, and their reporting of the results of their operation is backwards. The trains, the groups of trains that they say and apparently think do well are actually the worst performing trains in the system, and vice versa. And I want to show you how they get to that conclusion. Let's look at the misrepresentations of financial results first. What is the APT? APT, the Amtrak Performance Tracking System, Amtrak describes as their only route accounting system. It's the successor to the notorious route profitability system, the RPS system that they used for decades. What it is a custom-built, one-off cost allocator that was constructed by Amtrak management with the help of a very costly outside consultant. And what it does, how it works is, it collects into thousands of individual line accounts all of the costs of Amtrak's various activities around the country. It gathers them into central accounts in Washington and then allocates 80% of those costs. 20% get traced, they say, traced to the activities that incur the cost. But 80% of those costs get allocated not by tracing them back to whatever incurred them, but by management algorithms. And there's hierarchies of cascading algorithms, if this, then that. And it's an astonishingly complicated system, but it's a totally arbitrary, hypothetical system. And what it's designed to do is to create a report that hypothetically says, based on all of the assumptions baked into the system and based on all the algorithms that management made up to assign costs back out to different activities, those trains and those routes that have a negative number assigned to them by APT, what that negative number represents is not a profit or a loss. These are not financial statements. What it is a hypothetical statement of what that train or route would have to earn in addition to what it's doing based on all the assumptions and in concert with every other train and route in order for the company as a whole to break even. Totally arbitrary, totally hypothetical. Change any of the algorithms and the results change, even if the operations remain identical. It doesn't handle capital items well. That's not me saying that. That's the working papers for APT that say that. It doesn't produce a statement of incremental costs of any activity. That's not me. That's the working papers. That's the Office of the Inspector General has said that APT doesn't do one of the key things that it was meant to do when it was set up, which is to create a statement of incremental costs. They call them avoidable costs, but they mean the same thing. It doesn't do that. The most important thing I'll tell you today is this. APT reports, which is the only basis Amtrak has for reporting route results, are not profit and loss statements. Those are not income statements that are part of a set of financial statements. APT does not comply, and it doesn't pretend to comply, with generally accepted accounting principles. It is not a financial accounting system like any business organization and many other non-business organizations use to track their financial results of operations. That's not what it does. It's incapable of doing that, and its reports are not income statements. So when Amtrak tells you that Train A lost money and Train B made money, they don't know that. That's not what APT is telling them. And they have no way of knowing otherwise because they say that's their only route accounting system. Let me give you two examples to illustrate the real-world consequences of what I'm talking about. Take the group of trains that make up the regional corridor trains, what Amtrak lately has taken to calling the state corridors. According to APT, in fiscal 17 that ended a year ago, The regional corridor trains incurred they say loss, I say a negative value, of about $100 million. But you all know that all or nearly all of those trains operate under contracts with sponsoring states that obligate the state to pay Amtrak money, cash money, in an amount equal to the difference between the train's revenues and its APT-determined fully allocated costs. You can't lose money on that deal. Those trains are all, every last one of them, cash positive to Amtrak on that basis. But APT says they, quote, lose, unquote, $100 million a year. It can't be true, and it's not true. Another example, this is one's closer to my heart. For fiscal 17, APT says, and senior executives of Amtrak, Anderson and Gardner in particular, were running around this summer telling people that the long-distance trains as a group lost $500 million in fiscal 17. They were representing to the public, the media, and United States senators from New Mexico and Colorado this summer that the Southwest chief lost $54 million based on APT statements to that effect. But that's not what APT does. Here's what the long distance trains as a group really did. In May of 2017, when Wick Moorman was chairman or CEO of Amtrak, he signed a letter to Congress. It was on their website the last time I looked a couple weeks ago. It was the transmittal letter for their fiscal 18 budget and subsidy request. Wick Moorman told Congress, which had was dealing with the White House's budget proposals for fiscal 18. For Amtrak, the White House proposed getting rid of all the long-distance trains. Why? Nobody rides them, and they cost a fortune, according to Amtrak. Logical conclusion, and it makes sense, is if that's the case, get rid of them. Wick Moorman told Congress, you can't do that. Don't get rid of the long-distance trains, because if you do, Moorman said, the corporate level loss at Amtrak and our resulting subsidy requirement will go up, not down, by $423 million in fiscal 18, the year that just ended. Let that sink in. Moorman's telling Congress, if you get rid of this group of trains that my deputy is telling you lost $500 million, my subsidy will go up by $400 million. Well, how does that happen? If you've got an activity that's losing money and you stop doing it, what happens to your overall results? Do they go up or down? They got to go up. And he's saying it's going to go down by $423 million. Can't have it both ways. I choose to believe Wick Moorman. I don't know where he got the number. That's all. That question always comes up. I don't know, but I choose to believe it, partly because that number corresponds very closely to the independent analysis that my organization's done trying to estimate the financial results of individual long-distance trains. I don't think the Southwest chief lost $54 million. I think it contributed something in the range of $20 million of free cash flow. And the group contributed $423 million of free cash flow this past fiscal year. That's a pretty good result. And it's the opposite of what Amtrak tries to tell people the actual result is. Again, APT does not generate financial results because it is incapable of doing so. These reports are not income statements, and those negative numbers are not losses. And the same thing's true in the Northeast Corridor. And the other way around, Amtrak will tell you, here's a weasel word warning, that the Northeast Corridor is operationally profitable. Well, what do they mean by that? I'll decode that for you. The word operationally is a fig leaf to cover the fact that when Amtrak tells you that the Northeast Corridor made money, that they are not charging against NEC revenues the huge annual costs of upkeep of the NEC's fixed facilities. Track, bridges, tunnels, power systems, Bear, Delaware maintenance shops, and all that stuff. The fixed facilities, the infrastructure in the NEC. Those costs, where are those costs? They're off in the next room, hidden in different accounts. Amtrak calls them capital costs. That's not a defined term, but what they are using that to describe are costs of fixed facilities. And when you bring those back into the real world and charge them against the NEC's not inconsiderable revenues, the NEC, as a standalone operation, using generally accepted accounting principles, loses somewhere north of $1 billion a year. If Wick Moorman told the truth to Congress, and I think he did, and if the regional trains are operating under contracts that guarantee that they are cash positive to Amtrak, the conclusion necessarily follows that not 1 penny of the annual federal subsidy is going to support either the long-distance trains or the regional corridors. And I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out, well, where else could it be going? We think that David Gunn was telling the literal truth when everybody else thought he was bluffing, when David Gunn said, if I don't get every penny of my subsidy request, I'll shut down the Northeast Corridor. That threat probably cost him his job, and everybody at the time thought it was one of these kind of give me the money or I'll shoot the dog kind of deals. But I think David Gunn was telling the literal truth. He needed every dollar of that to keep that NEC property up and running. And it gets worse. It goes downhill from there. APT is also rigged. Remember, the APT numbers are what management wants them to be because management wrote the algorithms. They're not financial algorithms. They're not generally accepted accounting principles. Let me just jump to the final conclusion of this. It is, in simple terms, it is fraudulent for Amtrak to represent to anybody that APT-generated numbers are financial results of operation, because they're not. They can't be because the system isn't designed to produce financial results. Okay, let's take one further step on APT, and it gets worse still, and that is because APT does not, it can't, because it's not programmed to do it, can't generate a statement of incremental costs of adding or subtracting any activity. They have no way of knowing. They don't have a system that tells them that. And the only thing that they're capable of doing using APT data, when somebody asks the question, like you heard this morning, add a 7th car to the Hiawatha trains, the only way Amtrak can answer that question is by doing a linear extrapolation of average total costs, which is what APT is reporting. It's not an incremental cost. APT doesn't do incremental costs. The OIG says so. So nobody knows what that would cost. And because of that, because APT, when somebody says add this, add that, add a train, add a route, add a car to an existing train, Amtrak can't answer that question except by extending average total costs on a linear basis to the new activity. This is why Amtrak management so vigorously resists growth. If all you know about your business is what APT tells you, and it's telling you, if I add a car, add a train, I lose more money, why would you do that? And they don't. And that's why they don't, because they're getting bad information from a flawed MIS. Now, let's talk about metrics. I represented to you a few minutes ago that Amtrak uses the wrong metrics and it produces bad decisions. Let's explore that for a minute. Let me ask you, seriously, it's not a joke, I'm not looking for my kind of cynical answer. What is Amtrak's business purpose? What's their mission? No. No. It's to move people where? Intercity, right? Intercity rail passenger service. You all agree on that?
Yeah.
It's not their core business function, but let's go with that. How do you measure moving people on an intercity basis by rail? How do you measure your production of that, your output? Nona?
Passenger miles.
Thank you. Passenger miles.
How does Amtrak do it?
Amtrak counts tickets. Have you ever heard Amtrak report route performance by RPMs? They always talk about ridership. Why do they do that? Ridership exaggerates the performance of certain of their corridors, their short corridors. Have you ever seen Delta report ridership? Delta reports load factor and passenger miles. They're looking for output and capital efficiency. Amtrak has this data. They hide the passenger mile data. You can dig out the load factor data, but they never report it. And I'll just, Mark, can we get that slide up? This is the one visual I want to show you to give you a real sense of what we're talking about. This is a slide from a talk I gave in California about 4 years ago. The numbers are different. This is from 2013, but the pattern is the same. It's the relationships that are important on this graphic, not the numbers. When you look at Amtrak's three groups of trains, the Northeast Corridor, the regional corridors, and the long distance, and when you look at the right metrics to describe the performance of these groups, you will soon see, when the projector comes up, you will soon see that the long distance trains as a group produce the most RPMs. Okay. Can you see that? In this year, we had the anomaly that the Northeast Corridor was actually the smallest division Amtrak operated by output. It produced the least transportation of any of the three groups in the country. The long distance trains produce half again the total output of the Northeast Corridor. And the regional corridors are always right in there with the NEC. I mean, did you know that all of the regional corridors around the country produce almost the same output as the Northeast Corridor? You don't know that because Amtrak never tells you that. That's RPMs. This is load factor. What does load factor tell you? Load factor is a measure basically of capital efficiency. Am I using my capital effectively to get the most return that I can? In a business, you're going to measure it financially. In an operation like Amtrak, which is sort of a business, sort of an agency, you just look at it in terms of how much intercity transport am I getting per dollar invested. Load factor is a proxy for that. And what this slide shows you is that the typical Northeast Corridor load factors run at about 50%. There have been years when it's been just under 50. There have been years like this year, the year represented here, where it's just over 50. In 2017, it was just over 50. The short distance corridors had a good year that year. Their typical load factors most years is closer to the mid to upper 30s. And what that's telling you is that Amtrak can't sell 60, sometimes 65% of their inventory in those markets. The Northeast Corridor is much worse than that because we all agree, everybody who's ever been out in the Northeast and ridden one of those trains will tell you, from Philadelphia to New York, and then again, separate submarket, New York to New Haven, trains are full. And they're always full. And I'll stipulate that they're full. But what that tells you is, south of Philadelphia and east of New Haven, they're not full. If the total is 53%, and it's close to 100% in that 150 miles, that third of the Northeast Corridor, what's that tell you the load factor is elsewhere in the corridor? It's way down. Arithmetically, it can't exceed about 25%. And that tells you, and then if you want to do another calculation, back out of the ridership in the Northeast Corridor, the ridership that in terms of statistical classification isn't even intercity, it's commuter, it's less than 100-mile recurring traffic. Commuter traffic is defined, or intercity traffic is defined by the U.S. Bureau of Transportation Statistics as non-recurring traffic over 100 miles. So if you take traffic that's recurring and under 100 miles and just set it aside, Amtrak's load factors in the Northeast Corridor are unbelievably low. They can't sell the vast majority of the inventory they produce. Long distance trains, 63%. URPA's analysis suggests that on a long distance route, a train that has an annual load factor of 65% is sold out, because a seat that's vacant at any given point on a given run has already been sold to somebody who's boarding down line. At 65% load factor, you can't sell more tickets for all practical purposes. So when Stephen Gardner does what he did this summer and tells people in the West that the Southwest Chief is half empty, nobody rides it because its load factor is only 60%, he's lying by omission. He's not telling people that train's darn near full, sold out. Okay, when you use the right metrics to look at the performance of the different groups of trains, that's the basis on which I claim that the long distance trains are the largest and most commercially successful trains Amtrak operates. There's another factor, and this is a really important one. It's not based on Amtrak numbers. This is one that we've calculated, and that's market share. That tells you what percentage of a given market does a given enterprise command. This hotel has a market share of hotel room nights in Milwaukee of, 0.5%, or whatever that number would be. And that tells you the role that this plays in that broader market. In the Northeast Corridor, if you look at intercity traffic, the market share is about 1.5%. It's trivial, 1.5%. There's some measures that suggest that the buses are carrying more people longer distances in the Northeast Corridor than Amtrak is. At $1 billion a year. Are we getting our money's worth on that? No. Market shares for the individual long distance trains, the Empire Builder in its market, in its corridor, has a market share that we think is about 5%. So that's more than 3 times the market share of the Northeast Corridor trains. So these long distance trains, it's the largest group, it's the most commercially successful group, and it's the group where public capital is getting its biggest return. Anderson wants to get rid of it. And that makes no sense at all. He's using the wrong metrics, and he's using a screwball accounting system that paints a completely false picture about how these trains are doing. And these trains will not draw investment or attention or survival until you reverse that outlook, until you get the right metrics and an honest accounting using generally accepted accounting principles. And that's how you have to fix the problem. You've got to break open the fraud of misusing APT as if it were financial results, and you have to use the right metrics to measure the results of operations of these different trains. It's not easy to do. This is hard work to do this. Embedded perceptions are hard to alter. Everybody in this room knows this stuff because you guys study it, and you're, whatever it is, 30 people out of 5 or 6 million in Wisconsin, and you're the only ones who know that. And I venture to guess that half of you didn't know it until I explained it now. So you have to overcome that, and it's not easy to do. Everybody knows that the long distance trains don't do very well because Amtrak's been saying that for 40 years. The FRA, who's supposed to be the adult supervision in the room, is heavily invested in APT. They're very defensive about it. They've got a lot of money in it. And it presents results that corroborate their own biases about where they want to develop rail passenger service. There's a political dimension because the NEC commuter agencies depend on the public perceptions created by APT, because Amtrak, in spending the $1 billion plus that they spend every year on the Northeast Corridor, is providing a $300 to $400 million a year indirect subsidy to the commuter agencies by keeping up infrastructure that Amtrak does not need for its own train operations there. And Amtrak needs APT to prop up their own biases in favor of the Northeast Corridor and their high-speed fantasy up there, including the Gateway project. If the decision makers in Congress understood what I've just explained to you, they would be far less inclined to lavish $1 billion plus a year on supporting the Northeast Corridor train operations. And if they did, it would be raw political power, not anything to do with intelligent investing. And I would also suggest to you that it's not enough, even after you are willing to take on trying to change public perceptions about results of train operations, it's still difficult because it's not enough to fight to preserve what we have. If we don't start growing, Amtrak is going to continue to fade. Their national contribution to mobility it's so small. Motorcycles produce more passenger miles in this country every year than Amtrak does. And it doesn't cost $1.5 billion to do it. That's where Amtrak is, and their market share is declining year over year. Amtrak, to survive, for us to keep the passenger trains that we all value, we have to grow the business. But to grow the business, you've got to get past these perceptual problems, because it makes no sense. It makes no sense for any investor, public or private, to throw capital into something that nobody buys and loses a fortune. It'll take a targeted publicity campaign. You have to get this information into the media. You have to get it into the hands of legislators, and that takes patient explanation. You have to sit down with people, with reporters, with legislative staff people, and explain this stuff to them and tell them you're getting fooled. You're getting played, in effect. In my advocacy, I include a pitch for divestiture of ownership of the Northeast Corridor. It is the ownership burden of that infrastructure that brings Amtrak down financially. I'd love to see Amtrak be relieved of that. That doesn't mean that their track rent to a neutral owner of the NEC is going to go to zero. It won't, but it'll be less than what it is now. I'd also encourage competitive entry. You heard Dave Christensen this morning talk about a half a dozen places in North America where public and private operators are operating passenger trains on a commercially and financially successful basis. We need more of that. There's no aspect of American life where we tolerate having a monopoly. Nowhere, not in hotels, not in food service, not in health care, nothing do we tolerate a monopoly like we do for rail passenger service. We won't get growth, we won't get improvement, we won't get a better deal in this country until we have more bright lines and more competitive service in new and existing markets. Because of the load factors, is that still up there? Yes, it is. Because of these load factor numbers, the long distance trains are the only segment where meaningful growth is even possible in the short term. Yes, the Hiawatha Corridor is doing very nicely, but those growth figures, if we quantify that against the output of the long distance trains, it's a tiny, tiny number. I should have brought another slide I've got that shows the output by passenger miles, the load factor, and the market shares of all the Chicago hubbed regional corridors against the Chicago hubbed long-distance trains. And I'll just summarize a very neat slide. The long-distance trains are up here, the regional corridors are down here. They're socially useful things. I'm not opposed to regional corridor trains, but if you're dishing out the capital to fund growth, reinvestment, things that make rail passenger service more meaningful to more people, you've got to start where the strength is, and that's in the long-distance markets. So that's the world according to me. I hope that stimulated some thought on your part. With however much time is left, John,
Oh, we got 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
I'll love to take questions, or if you want to argue with me, that's cool too.
Just as a statement, up until about 20 years ago, Amtrak monthly issued person miles per train mile, then they got rid of it.
Yeah, passenger miles per train mile is a different way of getting at load factor. If you want more of them, run shorter trains. Then your load factors go up. No, let's start here.
We all know that the Northeast Corridor is unfair on the face of it, because if Wisconsin wants another train, we have to pay for it.
Right.
Yes?
And those states have never been forced to pay for that right of way.
They're getting a $300 to $400 million subsidy from Wisconsin and all the other states.
Exactly. So recent figures from Amtrak, Derek James of the Public Affairs said that he showed the long distance loss, and I sent you his slides, and the corridor profit, and then the Amtrak spends about, I think it was like $6 million that the state trains cost them, because not every cost can be passed through, which I assume was, management or something, but who knows? Technically, we're supposed to pay for all of that. But that was their big, those are their current figures. That's what they just told me.
Wisconsin's contract calls for that. But what I'm telling you is the only place Amtrak has to get those numbers are APT. APT is this Rube Goldberg thing that just produces whatever numbers management tells it to.
They might as well use a dartboard.
It's not a financial accounting system.
I have a question. They want to get rid of these long-distance trains, but I've always believed that it would take, if they got rid of them, it would take almost 5 years for them to realize the savings, because the crews and whatever, and the equipment and whatever, you can't use a lot of the equipment in different parts of the country, and the crews would be getting paid for 5 years whether they work or not. So where would be the savings of?
If you thought that that group of trains was costing $500 million a year, you'd take the labor waste in order to get out of that business. Amtrak's talking out of both sides of their mouth on that.
And I have another question too. Like, you look at all the things that are kind of wrong with the Northeast Corridor, like a lot of the bridges and whatever are over 100 years old. The tunnels are ready to fall apart and whatever. So anything like that would, if the BFRA would ever come and say, well, it's unsafe for us to take a train across that, but you couldn't run a train from Washington to New York.
Amtrak will tell you, I don't know exactly what the number is this week, but they'll tell you that their accumulated, and this is just such a wonderful political phrase, state of good repair deficit, that's deferred maintenance, right? In the Northeast Corridor is something like $25 billion right now. And they want taxpayers in Alabama and every place else to cough up that money to bring the Northeast Corridor into a state of good repair. Why? I mean, I hate to say this, but it is true that if the Northeast Corridor, if Amtrak shut down in the Northeast Corridor tonight and never ran another train with a 1.5% market share, you wouldn't miss it. It would vanish without a ripple. Nothing in any business anywhere that has a 1% market share is going to go away and cause a problem by doing that. If this hotel shut down tonight, would the hotel industry in Milwaukee be injured? No.
Couple things. Okay, realize we shared dinner last night, so the conversation started last night. So the current chairman of Amtrak came from Delta. uses the passenger per mile standard to report how they did business. Yet he comes to Amtrak and we're following the APT metrics. Was he hired? I don't know. Was he hired because he would follow the APT metrics versus the revenue per passenger mile? You probably don't know the answer to that.
I don't know. That's not publicly known. When I hear a question like that, I go back to the advice I get from my colleague who says, never assume conspiracy when simple ineptitude explains what's going on.
Okay, so you were here at the beginning and John talked about the activism, and his suggestion was not to go directly to the chairman, but to go to the board. What I'm going to ask you is, with his comment in mind, and if you want to chime in, John, go right ahead. How do you reconcile what you said with his call to action?
I agree entirely with what John said. I don't think there's any reconciliation involved. I think your advocacy needs to be aimed at actually three sources, or three targets. One is the media. You've all seen the newspaper articles. They all regurgitate the Amtrak propaganda. You have to go to reporters. Every time you see an article like that, write them a letter. Politely, calmly say, you got it backwards, and here's why. And if you want to explore this, I'll talk to you about it. I've had maybe 2 out of 3 times when I write a letter like that, I'll at least get a telephone conversation with a reporter. I don't know if it's changing minds, but it helps. It helps. You start to sort of undermine the credibility of the propaganda coming out of Washington. Second target is your transportation staff person for your congressional delegation. There's fewer senators than there are congressmen, so it's easier to find them and talk to them. 2 or 3 days ago, I spent 2 hours with a transportation staff guy for one of the Minnesota senators, and basically gave him the speech I just gave you, and he's scribbling notes as fast as he's never heard this stuff. He's never heard that, and this comes as a revelation to him. And third is what John was talking about. I think what John was talking about this morning is, don't go to Anderson. Anderson's, either his mind is made up, or what you would have to tell him is contradicting what he's getting from his executive staff and his own computers. Okay, so which is he going to believe? A nobody from the sticks? Me or you? Or is he going to believe what his staff and his computers are telling him? He's hopeless. You could try embarrassing him a little bit publicly, but I agree with John, go to the board. Go to the Secretary of DOT, go to the head of FRA. Those are the people who, in theory, are providing the adult supervision.
You talked about the NEC and the deferred maintenance cost of infrastructure. Would you disagree with the government, federal and or state, probably both combined, taking over and operating and upgrading the infrastructure of the Northeast Corridor and several other public rail corridors, and allow Amtrak or private operators or anybody else to operate over them and see if they make a profit and how many people they can carry? Equalizing that infrastructure with every other piece of infrastructure we have in the country, i.e. the interstates, everything else. If you shut down the interstate, the NEC tomorrow and build an interstate on it, you may or may not equal the performance, obviously, that you have from the NEC, or at least the potential that it has for moving passengers.
South of Philadelphia and east of New Haven, I think you would exceed it because it's so trivial now.
Right.
In the commuter territories between Philadelphia and New York, then a separate market, New York to New Haven, I don't think that's true, but I don't know why that's a federal issue. I don't know why SEPTA, New Jersey DOT, and Metro North can't deal with that.
But why don't
But
you feel that they should, though?
your first point,
Yeah.
did everybody hear Dave's comment? Basically, let's move the infrastructure into a different
Into a public sector.
public sector holding thing, a rail track like they have in Britain. The most important, and the answer is yes to that part, but the most important part of what Dave said, without which isolating the infrastructure is just shuffling papers, is opening up access for competitive entry into that market. Let New Jersey Transit run all the way into Philadelphia. Let Virgin Trains put a bright red high-speed train on the whole corridor. Without that kind of competitive entry, you're just kidding yourself. I don't know, I really seriously don't know why the fellow from the state didn't talk about opening up the Hiawatha corridor to competitive bidding. Why are we sole sourcing that to Amtrak? And if the answer is, well, CP won't let anybody else on the railroad, there's answers to that. You go to CP with your checkbook and you pay them fair market value for the track access. If you're not prepared to do that, you're not serious about developing rail passenger service. You can't take somebody else's industrial property without compensating them for it. That's just wrong. That's not how it works in the United States.
Well, let's give a round of applause and thanks.
All right. Thank you.
And going